The dialogue wheel has been a staple in Bioware games ever since Mass Effect introduced it, but many people at this time, and still now, dislike the dialogue wheel for various reasons. So let's go through the reasons people dislike it and see if it is legitimate. It limits the amount of dialogue options the player can have, and therefore the number of role-playing options the player has. This is by far the biggest issue people say the dialogue wheel has. There is some truth to this on a technical level. Yes, Mass Effect has only offered the 3 options in dialogue, but the question on why it only offers 3 dialogue options is never asked. A lot of people assume that there are only 3 options because Bioware hates options and role-playing, when this isn't the case. In RPGs, dialogue options, choices in general, and the idea of an RPG exist to allow the player to express themselves in the role they are playing. The role can either be defined by the player, meaning the role has no limitations placed on it. This usually ends up with games like Fallout New Vegas, where the player has a lot of freedom to define themselves within the game setting, or the role is defined by the developer, which usually ends up with games like Mass Effect. Therefore, the options on offer are informed by the role the player is playing. The role the player is playing in Mass Effect is Commander Shepard. The dialogue options available are so few because it is focusing on what Commander Shepard will say, not the player. This is like a player in D&D complaining about how they can't kill orphans because they are a paladin. Of course, a paladin won't kill orphans. It isn't their character to do so. The paladin's options are restricted, but that doesn't mean it is a bad thing. It just means that the options provided are considering what a paladin might do and not what the player might do. For example, a paladin has these 2 choices: let the villain run away or save people and his family from the monsters the villain summoned. This is a dilemma for the paladin: what to do. So, just because the dialogue wheel has fewer options than a dialogue list doesn't mean it is bad. RPGs like the ones Bioware makes are often focusing on that idea, providing choices on what the player character might do, which results in said character being able to play a bigger role in the story and themes. Because in RPGs where the player gets to define the role, the player character in the game can't have any limitations put on them without interfering with the player's ability to define their role. So the reason Mass Effect doesn't have so many options aren't due to the dialogue wheel being inferior or Bioware hating choices and role-playing. It is due to the role the player plays in Mass Effect. Thus, when Dragon Age Inquisition came out, the Inquisitor was a lot more of a broader role, which allowed the player more control on how to define them and therefore had more options. The dialogue wheel can support many options. Now this is gonna get into the weeds a bit, and it's not entirely related to the topic being discussed, but I feel this is worth mentioning. All dialogue options boil down to 3 options. Now what do I mean by that? The outcomes of the dialogue options in RPGs boil down to positive remark, which means you will help the NPC or be positive towards them; neutral remark, which means you won't help the NPC and therefore do not do their quest or be neutral towards them; negative remark, which means you will hurt them, kill or actively harm the NPC or be negative towards them. In Baldur's Gate 3, you can talk to Zevlor and your options are to help him, don't help him, or be rude to him. Why am I mentioning this is to build on the previous point I made about why the dialogue wheel has 3 options. It is focused on what the character will do, while in other dialogue interfaces it focuses on what the player wants to do, or wants to say. So while the options will result in 3 different outcomes, the option itself will offer many different ways of saying that. Back to the topic at hand. Now this isn't to say that the dialogue wheel isn't without issues. For example, the dialogue wheel gives the player more agency in a conversation than a dialogue list. Since the player knows what options in a dialogue wheel will do, right hand side is to continue the conversation or end it, left hand side is to ask questions. From top right to bottom right, the options go from positive to hostile, and in later Bioware games, the dialogue wheel has tone indicators. The dialogue wheel allows the player to control the conversation more and have knowledge on what the dialogue options will do. It ends when they want it to end. While in a dialogue list, the player doesn't quite know which options will continue the conversation or which options will end the conversation. All they can really do is guess what the dialogue option will do. What this means is that the NPCs the player is talking to has a lot more agency in the conversation. You can't predict how they will react with certainty because the dialogue options don't tell you what will happen. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Depends on what you want and what the game is trying to do. Personally, I like knowing what dialogue options do. It allows me to ask questions without feeling like it'll end abruptly. There is an obvious question to ask here though. Am I saying dialogue lists can perform the same functions as a dialogue wheel? Well, I'll get back to that question a bit later. For now, let's move on to the next point. The paraphrase dialogue lines and the actual dialogue line do not match. Now this is a more valid complaint. There are many examples where the dialogue options chosen don't match up with what is actually said, and this isn't good. There isn't more I can add to this. Bioware should probably have the dialogue, display the full dialogue line when you're hovering over the option. The dialogue wheel negatively impacted other RPGs. Is this true? Kind of. Most people assume it's Bioware's fault for RPGs getting worse with the introduction of the dialogue wheel. But is this the fault of the dialogue wheel or the fault of the people who are using the dialogue wheel? It is the latter. Other development studios who used it didn't understand why Bioware used it. Some of them do, certainly, but not most of them. Fallout 4 is the example people use the dialogue wheel, making RPGs worse. It doesn't use the format of the dialogue wheel, but it is influenced by it. Emil Pagliarulo said in a gaming conference that they were inspired by Mass Effect to change how they present their dialogue. Now, the issue with this change is that Fallout isn't the type of RPG Bioware makes. Fallout is more about allowing the player to define their role within the game. It is Bethesda's fault for not understanding what Fallout is, and not Bioware's fault for popularizing the dialogue wheel. Was it Gears of War's fault for the many bad cover shooters after it? No, it isn't. In a way, the dialogue wheel did negatively impact other RPGs, but that isn't Bioware's fault. They didn't compel other developers to follow along. It was other developers who chose to do what Bioware did. Additionally, the implication of the dialogue wheel negatively impacted other RPGs implies that it somehow inherently goes against what RPGs stand for, which just isn't the case. I asked in a community post issues people have with the dialogue wheel, so let's go through them. Anna B says, my biggest problem comes with the romance options. There is always only one option, so the second you decide to pursue a romance, your character's whole personality changes. Romance probably isn't the only place this happens, but it's the most obvious to me. Now, I do agree with this for quite a bit, but there's a lot of complications when you try to think about that, because one, many different characters will be wooed differently. You can't use the same, romance style or romance dialogue for many different companions. Now, I do, again, as I said, agree with this, but it's very complicated because now you have to make many different romance options that fit the personality of your character, but also get across to the other character that you're interested in them romantically. It's an odd thing to think about, and I'm not necessarily sure how Bioware would solve this issue, though I do agree with the commenter. Purple Lilith says, the dialogue wheel is just another form of interface. Bad paraphrasing is not an issue of the dialogue wheel, it's a writing issue. Also, limited options are not an issue of the dialogue wheel. There are games with limited options that are used dialogue lists that usually lead to awkwardly nested dialogue trees. Now, this is something I'm going to mention a bit later on, but I do agree with this. Blazing Tiger 5000 says, in Origins the dialogue wheel has had flavor instead of monotone emotive buttons. Dragon Age Origins featured dialogue mechanics like intimidation, persuasion, and other skills. However, after Dragon Age 2, those options disappeared, leaving players with only 2 choices instead of 3 or 4 ways to influence dialogue. The limitation narrows the possibilities for various scenarios you can experience. While dialogue wheels are functional, they lack flexibility and intuitiveness. Fortunately, games like Baldur's Gate 3 have a dialogue system similar to Origins, offering plenty of choices for players to select. Rolling a d20 and experiencing a critical failure in an intimidate speech is all part of the fun. Sometimes you can't quite achieve with a dialogue wheel. Okay, so I agree partially with this to a degree. I do think that it does suck that later Dragon Age games don't have, skills for dialogue, where you can't really intimidate, persuade, or use other skills that you have, like trap making or whatever, or poisons or cunning, like the cunning attributes and stuff like that, where you can't really use that in dialogue. Now, technically, Dragon Age Inquisition and 2 to an extent does have some form of this in special dialogues. For Dragon Age Inquisition, this is expressed by purchasing Inquisition perks where you will get an extra dialogue option. And it's cool and whatnot, but it's definitely not what Dragon Age Origins had, and it does suck that it's gone. Though I do disagree with a lot of this, saying that Dragon Age has very few ways or very few choices anymore, which just doesn't really make much sense. Because if you look at Dragon Age Origins, again, it does express itself through the 3 different dialogue options. meaning that the other options are normally just there to allow the player to express it in different ways and not necessarily to have a different outcome. It's flavors, but not much else. Another thing I disagree is the implication that the dialogue wheel is monotone emotive buttons. That doesn't make sense at all, especially when you play Dragon Age 2 in Dragon Age Inquisition. You can tell that that just isn't the case. And additionally, the weird thing to say that the wheel lacks flexibility and intuitiveness when it's like not that. The wheel is actually very intuitive. Again, right hand side is to end conversations or to continue it, and left hand side is to ask questions. In a dialogue list, you don't really understand what options do what. At Random Wanderer says, well, there have been a few. Bioware tends to show in the wheel that this is the nice option, this is the mean option, this is the stoic option, this is the funny option. Either with color coding or little symbols, dev as symbols. I prefer personally to carefully read through the options and choose without knowing which obvious box it falls into. Another complaint was when Mass Effect game rewards consistency, discouraging nuance. Now, I do agree with him to a degree that yes, the way Bioware uses the dialogue wheel is to ensure the player knows what's going on and what's happening by tone indicators. And again, this is more of a personal difference between us. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing to have a dialogue interface where you don't really have full information on what's going to happen, where you're just trying to say okay, this is what I think is going to happen, or oh, I chose this one which opened up an entirely new branch but I didn't know that. And I think that's fair to ask and fair to want. I obviously don't agree because, as I said before, I do prefer the dialogue wheel and the way it allows me to understand what's going to happen. Though I do agree completely that Mass Effect, especially only 1 to 3, because Andromeda got rid of the Paragon Renegade system, does reward the player just being consistent with one way. Because if you switch between Paragon and Renegade within Mass Effect 1 to 3, then you would just not have the options, the Paragon and Renegade options opened up anymore, which does suck. At Roman Noodles 101 says, my only one complaint about it is the abbreviation for dialogue options not being what you wanted to say once your characters started speaking. I understand why they have to paraphrase it, but sometimes on a rare occasion I feel like they could have worded them better. Besides that, I actually prefer the wheel a lot compared to the box in DAO or other RPGs. It feels nicer, but I can't explain why. Maybe it's more immersive to me. It also feels right for a voice protagonist, if that makes sense. I've heard people complain about the symbols in the dialogue wheel that depict the tone sometimes, but with the shortened versions of what you're going to say, I think it's helpful and necessary. Now again, as I mentioned before, I do agree that it's very bad how Bioware abbreviates the dialogue options of the dialogue wheel, because again, it can leave you blindsided, which isn't a good thing. As for the rest of the comment, I agree completely. At Emo Bear Writes says, it would be nice if it had an option that said, I care about you, that isn't related to romance. I'm thinking Cullen's personal quest in Dragon Age Musician. I did want to romance him, but the fact that I couldn't, I would still have liked the what do you want, and I care about you and believe in you options to be there. Ditto the other romanceable companion characters. The lines aren't perfect either. I end up insulting Alistair when I meant to try and joke with him. Tone isn't obvious from a written line of dialogue necessarily. Also, some people like silent protags so they can project themselves into them more readily, even though they claim the same about voice protagonists about more blank. So I do agree that there should be a lot more options with, having to say hey, I care about you, I still care about you, while not engaging in romantic intent. That's something I think is very valuable. Though I'm not necessarily sure if this is an issue with the dialogue wheel, or rather an issue with how Bioware is writing with it, because I don't necessarily think that's an inherent issue with the dialogue wheel. As for the other things they said, I think they're more referring to the dialogue list rather than the dialogue wheel, because dialogue lists don't really have an indication of tone. At Flip Life 67 says, my problem with the wheel, it's not enough choices, really just 3. As I said before in previous comment response and also this video, I don't necessarily think that's an inherent thing for the dialogue wheel. It's literally just Bioware writing the dialogue with the idea of the character who's saying it. Commander Shepard only really has 3 options because, well, that's what Commander would say. The Commander Shepard would say. If it was a blank slate protagonist, you would have to give more options because it would, need to have more ways for the player to express themselves. At Approva Sing 753 says, personally, I liked it in the newer game options and have little complaint. There feel it's right improvements, though it helped a lot for people how they're gonna react or going for romance or not, though there could be more dialogues added and put them on categories than just 2 to 4 options, often in later games. Maybe give us an option to pause between talk and read back and what they said for accessibility for disabled or those suffering with ADHD who either can't hear or read fast and need to check back and forth again. I won't blame them since it's a real voice actors, not mute protagonist, who can speak a paragraph, or that level of creativity won't that getting a burnout or delay even more expenses. So I do agree with them on the later issue, but to talk about the first part, again, I think the dialogue wheel and the sort of purpose that Bioware has used it for is to make it sure that the characters who are, in the game that you're playing as is representative. Because again, Commander Shepard only really has 3 options. Again, if it was a blank slate protagonist, it'd be different because you would have to have more options to represent what the player might want to say. But since it's Commander Shepard, you have to limit the amount of dialogue, the options that they have, to what they would say. As for the other stuff, I think it's a brilliant idea. I think being able to pause during dialogue and being able to check back mid-dialogue what the characters have said is just such a brilliant idea. It's something that Baldur's Gate 3 did, and I think it's very valuable, not only just as an accessibility feature, but also just as a good feature in general. At Believe It 105 says, but it is inferior. There are only a few complaints to be had, but they are big ones. 1. They don't display what actually gets said. The ranges from minor variations to things that are completely different and have a different context. 2. The emotion depicted, especially in Dragon Age 2, doesn't match the tone of the voice actor. Inquisition did it a little better. 3. There aren't enough options. You can ask questions sometimes and it loops you back into the main choice, but it always boils down to just 3 or fewer responses. Other than that, I would say it looks dumb or cheesy. Veilguard's dialogue wheel looks the worst out of the 3. On point 1 and 2, I don't think that's a dialogue wheel issue. That's literally not an issue with the dialogue wheel inherent to it. Dialogue lists can have the same issue as well, where a dialogue option that you chose has a different reaction, even if it's like, hey, I care about you, dude, and then the person responds says, you don't care about me. It's something that can happen in both a dialogue wheel and a dialogue list. 2, as well as a emotional depicted, that's not an issue with the dialogue wheel, that's just an issue with with the voice actors not matching up with the tone. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I don't think that's true, but if that was an issue, it's not an issue of the dialogue wheel. That's a separate thing. And as for 3, there aren't enough choices. Well, again, as I said before many times again, is that you have to understand that within the context of the character who's saying it, there's only so many options or ways they can say it. Again, this isn't a blank slate protagonist. These are characters that are defined. As for the dialogue wheel in Veilguard looking goofy, or dumb or cheesy, I have no idea. I think it looks quite nice. And that is the more popular complaints on why people dislike the dialogue wheel. The dialogue wheel isn't inherently inferior to the dialogue list, and vice versa. Which leads me to bring up the questions raised before. Can't a dialogue list perform the same functions as a dialogue wheel? And the answer is yes. The positions, icons indicating questions, tone, or continuing the conversation can be done in a dialogue list. You can just have icons next to the dialogue line that indicate the intent behind them. CD Projekt Red does this by having yellow mean continue the conversation, while white is asking questions. Owlcat indicates the intent of the dialogue by describing the tone of it. So why does the dialogue wheel exist then? If the advantages of it can be easily accomplished by having icons next to a dialogue line, why does it even exist? According to the 2006 beta gameplay trailer of Mass Effect 1,
Mass Effect is a truly next-gen experience. Rather than force you to read through piles of text, we want to put you in the moment. Now this may look like a cutscene, but this entire sequence is actually real-time gameplay.
Well, that's because it looked more cinematic and Bioware didn't want the player to read through a bunch of text. And I do agree that the dialogue wheel does make it look fairly cinematic, but that isn't an inherent thing. CD Projekt Red's dialogue looks just as cinematic, and so does Baldur's Gate 3's. Now, this doesn't mean every use of the dialogue wheel was done in service of not wanting the player to read a bunch of text. Obviously, the original purpose of the dialogue wheel has changed, and you can see this as Bioware has made more games with the dialogue wheel. They took advantage of those elements I spoke about. It's very understandable and gives you a lot of control over the conversation. But the advantages of the dialogue wheel aren't an inherent thing. You can make a dialogue list that contains all the advantages of a dialogue wheel. But then another question arises. If there is no difference between the dialogue wheel and the dialogue list, why shouldn't Bioware switch back to the dialogue list? Is it not nicer to be able to read the full dialogue line, so you understand what your character is going to say? The answer to this question will be different for everyone, but why I think Bioware will keep it is because it's a part of their identity now. They literally patented the dialogue wheel. If anyone wants to use it, they have to ask Bioware to use it, so it's no surprise that when most people see a dialogue wheel, they will think Bioware. It has ingrained itself into what a Bioware game should have. Whether you like it or not, having an entire dialogue interface design be associated with one company has a lot of power to it. As for my answer to this question, I don't care. If Bioware switches back, then that's fine by me. But if they stick with the dialogue wheel, then that's fine by me as well. All that really matters to me is that whatever dialogue interface they use, they make it clear on what the dialogue options do. So this video is obviously not just about how people misunderstand the dialogue wheel, it's also about the dialogue interfaces in general and how the only difference between them is aesthetics. A dialogue wheel can perform the same functions as a dialogue list and vice versa, and that is what people ultimately misunderstand about the dialogue wheel. The assumption is that the dialogue wheel and the dialogue list are completely different and can't do what the other can. That isn't true. Both styles are capable of doing what the other can, it'll just look different. Thank you so much for watching the video. I wanted to make this video because a lot of people don't really, again, understand the dialogue wheel or like dialogue interfaces in general. A lot of it just seems to be more on surface level details of, well, if you look at Bioware games, they're like bad, but if you look at games like that are not Bioware games like Baldur's Gate 3, they're actually good, and therefore dialogue lists better, without really examining why the dialogue list or the dialogue wheel even exist. I hope you enjoyed the video and got something from it. If you liked it, perhaps, consider liking the video and maybe even subscribing. And also comment down below, what do you think of what I said? Do you agree of what I said, that there's no real difference between dialogue interfaces and it's all just aesthetics? Or do you think there's more to it? Please leave a comment down below.